This is a case from the closing years of the 19th century in England, a period in which London stood at the height of its imperial reach while also bearing the weight of rapid urban growth and deep social division. It is to this setting in the southern district of the city that the present record directs attention. In the early 1890s, the parish of Lambeth lay just beyond the ceremonial heart of the capital. It was an area marked by crowded lodging houses, narrow streets, and a transient population drawn from the poorest ranks of urban life. Employment was uncertain, housing was temporary, and the daily movement of residents made sustained oversight difficult. Within such districts, sudden illness or unexplained death was not uncommon, and official notice was often delayed or absent. At the same time, the medical profession occupied a position of growing authority. Advances in education and scientific method had elevated the status of qualified practitioners, and the word of a man trained in medicine was commonly received without challenge. Yet, regulation remained uneven, and access to potent substances was not, subject to the controls that would be imposed in later years. It was within this environment where poverty and mobility reduced scrutiny, and professional knowledge conferred trust that Thomas Neill Cream, then in his early 40s, appeared, trained in medicine, and presenting himself as a qualified practitioner. He carried the outward authority of professional learning. He moved with ease through the streets and lodging houses of Lambeth, his manner and credentials affording him an appearance of experience and reliability in the eyes of those he encountered. The contrast between his mature professional bearing and the vulnerable circumstances of those he encountered formed a condition in which grave events could proceed without immediate suspicion. For many women living and working in these streets, opportunities for protection or redress were limited. Their lives were seldom recorded in detail, and their deaths were often noted with little inquiry. Thomas Neill Cream was raised within a family of sufficient means and respectability, circumstances that allowed him access to education and professional advancement. During his youth, he was taken from Scotland to British North America, where his family settled in Canada. This period of movement between countries did not place him among the destitute, but it did contribute to a life marked by detachment and mobility. As a young adult, Cream pursued medical training and was admitted to McGill University in Montreal. There he studied the accepted disciplines of 19th century medicine, including anatomy, therapeutics, and the use of chemical substances then employed in treatment. Upon completing his studies, he was able to present himself publicly as a qualified physician, a title that carried considerable authority and was rarely questioned by lay persons. In the mid-1870s, he entered into marriage with Flora Eliza Brooks in Canada. The relationship was brief and unsettled. Soon after the ceremony, Cream departed to continue his studies and travels abroad, leaving his wife behind. Within a short period, Mrs. Cream died under circumstances that aroused private suspicion among her family, though no formal inquiry was pursued and no legal action followed. Her death was recorded without extended examination and passed into obscurity. In the years that followed, Cream practiced medicine intermittently in Canada and the United States. He became associated with the provision of unlawful medical services, including clandestine abortions, which were conducted in secrecy and beyond effective oversight. Several women who sought his assistance during this period died shortly thereafter. At the time, these deaths were attributed to illness or complications, and none resulted in immediate prosecution. By the early 1880s, Thomas Neill Cream had removed himself from Canada and established a presence in the city of Chicago. There he resumed medical practice in a fragmented and informal manner, operating from rented rooms and boarding houses and presenting himself as a physician, prepared to treat ailments that others declined to address. Life during this period proceeded without apparent interruption, Despite the irregular nature of his work and the company he kept, the decisive rupture occurred in the summer of 1881. In July of that year, a man named Daniel Stio died after ingesting medicine said to have been prepared for the treatment of epilepsy. The symptoms observed prior to death were sudden and severe, prompting suspicion among those present. Subsequent examination determined that the substance administered contained strychnine, a poison well known for its violent effects and restricted medical use. Cream was arrested, tried, and convicted of murder. The sentence imposed was imprisonment for life, and he was conveyed to the state penitentiary at Joliet to serve his term. This judgment marked the first occasion on which his conduct resulted in formal legal consequence. It also fixed in official record his willingness to employ lethal substances under the guise of medical treatment, a fact that would assume grave significance in the years that followed. In the late 1880s, circumstances beyond the prison walls began to alter his position. The death of a close family member resulted in an inheritance of some means, and petitions for clemency were advanced on his behalf. These representations were ultimately successful. In the year 1891, executive authority intervened, and Cream was released from custody after serving a decade of his sentence. The decision was recorded as an act of clemency, and no further restriction was placed upon his movements. Upon regaining his liberty, he did not resume life in the United States. After a brief return to Canada, he departed for England, traveling by sea and arriving at Liverpool in the autumn of that year. From there, he proceeded to London, where he took lodgings in the southern districts of the city. When Thomas Neill Cream settled in Lambeth in the closing months of 1891, he occupied furnished rooms near the river, paid his rent regularly, and presented himself as a medical man recently returned from abroad. His manner was quiet, and his movements followed no fixed routine that would have drawn early attention from neighbors or authorities. During this period, Cream renewed habits that had marked earlier stages of his life. He frequented public houses and lodging houses where women of limited means gathered, offering conversation, small sums of money, and, on occasion, medical advice. His training allowed him to speak with confidence on matters of health, and he carried with him pills and powders, which he described as remedies for common complaints. Such conduct was not unusual in districts where access to formal medical care was limited. At the same time, he made arrangements that suggested preparation rather than chance. He acquired strychnine in small quantities, obtaining it without difficulty through ordinary commercial channels. He also began to compose letters under assumed names, addressing them to medical men and others of standing. These letters referred obliquely to deaths and hinted at concealed wrongdoing, while stopping short of direct accusation. No action followed at first, and the correspondence was treated as nuisance rather than warning. To outward appearance, life in Lambeth continued in its accustomed manner. Illness, drink, and sudden collapse were familiar occurrences rarely examined with care. Yet, beneath this surface, a pattern was forming. Cream's access to potent substances, his deliberate approach to vulnerable individuals, and his habit of setting events down in writing combined to create a condition in which a more serious sequence could unfold. The signs were present, though their significance had not yet been recognized. The women with whom he associated lived precarious lives dependent upon irregular earnings and temporary shelter. Many were accustomed to accepting assistance wherever it was offered, particularly when it came in the form of medical advice or relief from pain. In such circumstances, the presence of a man who claimed professional knowledge was neither unusual nor unwelcome. Pills and powders were exchanged without record, and their effects were rarely questioned. Deaths, when they occurred, were commonly attributed to drink, illness, or exhaustion. The crowded conditions of the district and the transient nature of its population made sustained inquiry difficult. Inquests were often brief, and conclusions were reached on limited information. Where no immediate suspicion arose, matters were allowed to rest, although nothing in the streets of Lambeth at first suggested a departure from routine. Events began to change in the autumn of 1891. Following the execution of Thomas Neill Cream, public attention did not immediately recede from the Lambeth poisonings. On the contrary, the conclusion of the legal process opened a period of reflection, re-examination, and unease. The case had ended in certainty in the eyes of the law, yet it left behind questions that extended beyond the guilt of a single man. In the weeks after the hanging, newspapers revisited earlier stages of the affair with renewed scrutiny. Editorials reflected on how long Cream had operated without interference and how readily his claims of medical authority had been accepted. Commentators noted that his success depended not only on deception, but on the social conditions of the districts in which he moved. Poverty, overcrowding, and transience had combined to create spaces where lives passed with minimal record and deaths could be absorbed into routine. Medical journals also took notice. Articles appeared examining the ease with which strychnine and other poisons had been obtained. Though classified as dangerous, such substances were still widely available through chemists, often with little more than a stated purpose entered into a ledger. The Lambeth case was cited as evidence that professional titles and outward respectability could mask grave abuse. Calls were made for clearer regulation of poisons and for tighter oversight of those presenting themselves as medical practitioners. Attention also turned to the women whose deaths had formed the substance of the trial. For many readers, this was the first occasion on which their names had appeared in print at all. Ellen Donworth, Matilda Clover, Alice Marsh, and Emma Shrevel had lived on the margins of the city, their movements seldom traced, and their histories lightly recorded. In death, they had become evidence rather than individuals. Some writers sought to correct this imbalance by describing the conditions under which such women lived, emphasizing the narrow choices available to them and the constant vulnerability that shaped their daily existence. Within the police and coroner's offices, procedural reviews were quietly undertaken. Earlier inquests were examined to determine whether warning signs had been overlooked. The practice of rapid certification of death in crowded districts came under criticism, particularly where symptoms had been violent or unusual. Though no formal admissions of error were made, the case contributed to a gradual tightening of investigative standards in London's poorer parishes. Cream himself quickly became a figure of grim fascination. Pamphlets and broadsheets recounted his life in simplified terms, tracing a straight line from medical training to murder. In these retellings, complexity gave way to moral certainty. He was described as a monster concealed beneath professional polish, a man who had exploited trust with calculation and intent. Such portrayals satisfied public appetite for resolution, even as they obscured the systemic conditions that had allowed his crimes to continue. One persistent rumor refused to disappear. In the years that followed, speculation arose suggesting that Cream might have been responsible for other, more famous crimes, including the Whitechapel murders attributed to Jack the Ripper. These claims rested on coincidence rather than evidence and were dismissed by authorities and historians alike. Records clearly placed Cream in prison during the period of the Ripper killings. Nevertheless, the rumors endured, reflecting the tendency to attach unresolved horrors to known names once certainty had been established elsewhere. For the institutions involved, the Lambeth poisonings became a reference point. The case was cited in training and instruction as an example of how authority could be misused and how patterns, when viewed collectively, could reveal what individual incidents concealed. It stood as a reminder that the appearance of respectability did not guarantee safety, and that silence, whether born of fear, habit, or indifference, could be as enabling as active cooperation. As time passed, the physical traces of the case faded. Lodging houses were cleared or rebuilt, streets renamed, and residents replaced. The rooms where the women had lived and died passed into anonymity. What remained were documents, trial transcripts, medical reports, newspaper columns, and official registers. Together, they preserved a record not only of crimes committed, but of a city and a society in which those crimes have been able to unfold. In this sense, the Lambeth poisonings were not solely the story of Thomas Neill Cream. They were also the story of late 19th century London itself, a city of expanding power and deep inequality, where knowledge conferred trust, poverty invited neglect, and only belatedly did scattered events resolve into a pattern that demanded recognition. In the final analysis, the case of Thomas Neill Cream resists simple conclusion. Though the legal process reached its end on the gallows, the circumstances that shaped his crimes remained largely intact. London continued to expand, drawing thousands into its poorer districts, where lives overlapped briefly and disappeared without trace. The city absorbed tragedy as part of its daily rhythm, and only rarely did patterns emerge clearly enough to demand sustained attention. Cream's ability to operate depended less on ingenuity than on environment. He did not require secrecy in the conventional sense. His actions took place in open rooms, rented lodgings, and public streets. What shielded him was familiarity with illness, with sudden collapse, with unexplained death. In districts like Lambeth, these events were expected, even routine. When suffering is common, it attracts little scrutiny. Equally significant was the authority conferred by professional appearance. In an age when medicine was advancing rapidly, the figure of the trained doctor carried increasing weight. Certificates, credentials, and confident language were often accepted without question. For those with limited access to formal care, the distinction between legitimate treatment and dangerous deception was difficult to discern. Cream exploited this imbalance deliberately, presenting himself as a solution where few alternatives existed. The women who died at his hands lived under conditions that offered little protection. Their movements were unrecorded, their associations fluid, and their illnesses rarely investigated with care. Many existed beyond the reach of family oversight or institutional support. In such circumstances, trust was often extended quickly, particularly to those who claimed knowledge or relief from pain. That trust, once given, proved fatal. After the case concluded, reforms emerged slowly rather than decisively. Controls on poisons were strengthened over time, and greater attention was paid to the certification of death. Yet these changes followed a familiar pattern, incremental adjustments prompted by public alarm rather than fundamental transformation. The underlying disparities that had allowed Cream to act remained largely unchanged. In popular memory, Cream became a symbol rather than a subject of study. He was reduced to a cautionary figure, a warning about false respectability and hidden cruelty. Such simplification served a purpose, allowing society to locate evil within a single individual and move forward without confronting deeper questions. It was easier to condemn a man than to examine the conditions that had made his crimes possible. The records that survive tell a quieter, more unsettling story. They reveal not only deliberate harm, but indifference, haste, and fragmentation. Each death, viewed alone, appeared unremarkable. Only when assembled did they form a pattern. By then, the opportunity for prevention had passed. Today, the streets of Lambeth bear little resemblance to those of the 1890s. Buildings have been replaced, populations shifted, and names forgotten. Yet the dynamics that shaped this case, the intersection of authority and vulnerability, of trust and neglect, are not confined to a single place or time. They recur wherever oversight is uneven and lives are easily overlooked. The story of Thomas Neill Cream endures not because of its brutality alone, but because of what it reveals about how harm can persist unnoticed. It demonstrates how systems fail quietly, how warning signs are absorbed into routine, and how accountability often arrives only after irreversible loss. In the end, the case offers no comfort. It closes without redemption, resolution, or balance. What remains is a record of crimes committed, of lives diminished, and of a society that recognized danger only when it could no longer be ignored. And so the narrative concludes not with justice restored, but with a question left unresolved. How many similar patterns pass unseen, not because they are invisible, but because they are familiar?